Another popular opinion that's been making its rounds for quite some time now is that God is unjust for punishing Adam and Eve for eating the forbidden fruit. The skeptic says that it's unfair because this tree that they ate from was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so it's not fair to judge them because before they ate of the fruit, they didn't know what was good or what was evil. On the surface, this appears to be an open and shut case. How could you argue with that? But many people would be surprised to see the results that they get when they look just a little bit deeper. There's not just one, but really there are many different ways to address this apparent flaw in God's sense of justice. I will go through a few of them here, but just remember that there are many others that I just don't have the time to cover. The first point I'll make is that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not a tree that miraculously gave Adam and Eve the ability to know what is good and what is evil, but instead is a tree that, from the action of eating from, opened their eyes to their ability to choose what is good and what is evil for themselves. I will give you a couple of scriptures that help me to come to this conclusion. In Genesis chapter 3, the serpent comes up to Eve and tempts her with this question here. He says, "Has God indeed said you shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" Now I want you to pay very close attention to Eve's response to the serpent. She says, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God says you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die." In this statement alone, we can see that Eve already had some kind of understanding of what is right and what is wrong. When Eve uses the words "we may," that necessitates a conceptual framework for allowance, and allowance necessitates some understanding of the concept of authority. I'd also like to point out that Eve adds to the words of God when she says, "Nor shall you touch it." All God said was not to eat from this tree. So the fact that Eve adds to God's words makes it very clear to me that she was trying to justify the idea of eating from it by making God appear to be overly restrictive. Now, these concepts of being restrictive or these concepts of justifying are all concepts that pertain to the category of morality. If someone is overly restrictive, that means they are doing something wrong. And the way that Eve is trying to justify her idea of eating from this tree shows that she did have some type of idea or understanding of justice. We also know that Eve understood the authority of God by a revelation that we have in Romans chapter 1, starting at the 19th verse. We read, "Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." This is a very important revelation about the nature of us humans as being created in the image of God. Adam and Eve, being created in the image of God, have certain things that are intrinsic to their nature. We can see a few of these attributes right here. The word says that what may be known about God is manifest in them and understood by the things that God has made. We're also told that since the creation of the world, before Adam and Eve, God's eternal power or authority is clearly seen, which leaves men without an excuse. You see, this shows us that Adam and Eve intrinsically had an understanding of God's authority, and that was enough to leave them without an excuse or make them accountable. To strengthen my position that the idea that the skeptic has of the tree of knowledge and good and evil is in fact flawed, I will point out something else in the context of the account of the fall. Now, if the tree of knowledge of good and evil was in fact a tree that made them aware of what was good and what was evil, then we would expect that after eating from this tree, they would know what was good and what was evil. But this is not what happens at all. What did God say about creation after he was done creating it? Was it good or was it evil? Genesis chapter 1, verse 31 says, "Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good." Okay, everything was very good after God created it. Next question. When God created Adam and Eve, were they naked? Yes, they were naked. So was this good or bad? Well, according to God, this was very good. So here's the problem. What was the first conclusion that Adam and Eve came to after eating from the tree of knowledge and good and evil? Well, they felt that being naked was wrong and something that they should be ashamed of. So this clearly shows that the tree of knowledge and good and evil did not in fact give them the ability to know what was good and what was evil, but instead they now came to the realization that they had the ability to judge for themselves what was good and what was evil. Even though these facts, I believe, really make my case crystal clear, let's hypothetically grant the position of the skeptic. Let's say that Adam and Eve didn't know what was right and what was wrong before they were placed in the garden, before they were given the ability to eat from this tree. Would that then make God unjust in his punishment of Adam and Eve for their sin? Well, only if ignorance always trumps the concepts of good, evil, and justice. But even in our own human experience, that's not the case. During the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis were judged for their involvement in invasion and in their participation in the crimes that took place in concentration camps. But wait, that can't be just, because many of them thought that what they were doing was right. They thought they were just serving their country, which is an honorable thing to do. Well, apparently that doesn't matter. And most people will agree that in that situation, what happened was the concept of good and the concept of justice prevailed over the ignorance of those Nazis. In the same way, good, evil, and justice exist apart from Adam and Eve and their ignorance. Not only apart from, but over and above. So if this tendency to disobey God's command, which is evil, existed inside of Adam and Eve, then God is completely and perfectly justified in exposing this tendency that they had in any way he sees fit. That is just and that is good. Because the truth is, guess what? The things that exist in us don't disappear just because we become aware of them. Just because I'm aware that I will become hungry, it's not going to stop me from becoming hungry. And just because Adam and Eve are aware that there's a right and wrong doesn't mean that they will not do something wrong. And it also doesn't mean that God doesn't know that in the future they would do something wrong. Someone may object and say, well, then they weren't very good when God created them if they could do wrong. Well, that's really a different subject, but I will briefly address it. The concept of freedom is what God gave Adam and Eve, and freedom itself is very good. The twisting itself of the gift of freedom is not what God gave Adam and Eve, but instead is what they did. This goes into the concept of primary and secondary causes, which is a deeper philosophical discussion. There are other points I could make, but in fear of going too long, I will end with this. The fact that people question the justice of God is really a futile pursuit, because the first thing any thinking Christian should ask a skeptic that does this is, by what objective standard are you going to judge God by? Is it your own preference or what you feel is intuitive? If so, I hope you know that billions upon billions of people throughout history would disagree with your preferences. And they would also disagree in what you believe is intuitive. If you believe it's the current culture that has the right idea of justice, then your idea of justice is something that can change. So your idea of justice is really just a pointless word. It's like a constantly changing blob that molds and then remolds. It's like evolution. It just constantly changes. It never is the same thing. It's not something that can be pointed out. And if justice can mold and change, how do we say what mold is the right mold? With this view of justice, you could never have any standard of justice that you could call absolute. And if this is, in fact, what justice is, then how could we use this changing standard to judge the God who created all things that existed before us? God does, in fact, exist, so shouldn't He set the standard instead of us? Many people claim that good, evil, and justice are all subjective. Well, if you make this claim, you are cutting off the branch you're sitting on and shooting yourself in the foot. You're cutting off the branch you're sitting on when you say that God is absolutely wrong for doing anything that happens in the Bible. Yet at the same time, you say there are no absolutes when it comes to morality. And then you shoot yourself in the foot because when you make this argument, it shows that it's obvious to you that there are absolute moral standards and that you can't help but to live by these and be outraged when you see people or you believe someone has violated one of these. And now that you have involuntarily admitted that there are absolute standards of morality, you are also, in that same instance, arguing for God. Because the only way there can be an absolute moral standard is if this absolute standard existed before humans. It would have to be eternal. And in the process of this, that would also destroy the argument that God is somehow wrong for judging Adam and Eve for eating from the fruit, because of course if God is the standard, then there is no standard to judge Him by, because He is the standard. There is no standard separate from Him that we can use to judge Him. That's just not how authority and purpose work. God has authority over His creation, and what we are created for is our purpose. Whatever our purposes are good. That's just the plain and simple of it, whether you like it or accept it or not. And whether or not you like it or accept it won't change the reality of God's world. If you have problems accepting that, it's because just like Adam and Eve, you are trying to judge what is right and wrong for yourself instead of bowing down to the authority of your Creator. And from looking at what we see in the Bible and that looking through history, we can see that that was not a good idea. It did not turn out very well. And it will be even worse for those who do not accept the ultimate gift of life that God has provided to us through His only begotten Son, Jesus the Christ. We have sinned. He hasn't. We deserve punishment. He took it. God raised Him from the dead. And if we believe that, He will send us His Holy Spirit, which will save us from the power of sin in this life and from the consequences of sin for eternity. Something to think about.